So we try to reduce uncertainty in our world by coming up with rules, heuristics, shortcuts that seem to help guide us through interpreting our lives and things we encounter. And there's a number of heuristics we could talk about: anchoring, adjustment, working backward. But given our time limitations and your good commitment to being here today, let's focus on those you really need to know for your test. Knowing that there are others is sufficient at the intro level. Here's just a couple of examples. So means-end analysis is a heuristic to breaking problems down. If you've got a problem that's complex, it would be helpful if you could break it down into sub-problems and address each of those. And in doing that, you reduce the overall problem as a result. So if you look at getting a degree, getting a bachelor's degree, starting a career, those are long-term complex problems. But if you break it down, you say, well, a bachelor's degree is 40 classes. In this semester, I'm doing 4 or 5 classes. In this class, I've got a syllabus that says we're going to do a paper. In this paper, I have to have an intro, a methods, a results, and a discussion. And there you have it, breaking down to section to section. Rather than being overwhelmed by the overwhelming perspective of looking at everything as one, breaking it down, find what the ends are, then get the means to achieve them. You break those ends down into sub-goals, they become easier and easier to achieve. So this is a fairly practical approach to dealing with complicated issues that people oftentimes don't take into account. They get overwhelmed because they don't see it as a series of small solvable problems. They see it as one really big unsolvable issue. So coping with difficulties in life can be helped by some heuristics. Another one that's not very helpful and oftentimes leads us astray in our judgments would be the availability heuristic. The rule of thumb that the more available information is to us, the more likely it is to be true. The more probable it is. If I can think of it quickly, if it comes to mind quickly, it must be probable. It must be likely that that's a plausible or even more than likely plausible, more than plausible, but is probably the solution. So, like, if you think about words with the letter R in them in the third position, how many can you think of? And you have to sit there and you think about all the words with the letter R in the third position. You can think of them, surmise, and there you go. But you see how it takes a little bit of work. Now think of all the words that begin with R. And you can start rolling them off. And it would be easy, because those are more available, to think that there must be more of them. Because that seems to be logical. If I can think of lots of them, then there must be more of them. But there are more words with R in the third position than there are words with R in the first position. So that's just the illustration of availability. Because it's easy to think about, it becomes quite quick that we leap to the conclusion that it must be so. So looking at kind of a real-world example of that, because an event is prominent in our memories, seems like it might be more probable that it would happen. So you look at something like deaths from shark attacks. So if you're getting ready to go to the beach and you see a story on a shark attack in Australia and you get to the beach, all of a sudden you're more worried about getting in the water because that shark attack's prominent on your mind because you just saw the media coverage of it, and now you're perhaps overly worried about getting into the water. That happened back in my day when I was a kid, when Jaws came out. When Jaws came out, people started freaking out about getting into water. But if you look at it objectively, not in terms of what comes to mind quickest, right? We've got this shark attack, 36 fatalities in the entire history of the United States. Known at the time that this was written. 36 people, right? And people are freaking out about sharks. Statistics would indicate the probability of being bit by a shark, certainly of being killed by a shark, are exceedingly low. But what about cancer? Cancer takes about 1.6 million people out a year. And you don't see people fearing a pack of cigarettes, or fearing carcinogens, or fearing pollutants in their environment, or fearing things like that as much as they would sharks. Why? Because cancer is more pervasive. It's not a big media thing when somebody dies of cancer. When somebody dies of a lightning strike, or they die of a shark attack, or a plane crash that we think crashed, but we're not sure crashed, the next time somebody gets on a plane, they're wondering if their plane's going to make it to the next destination, even though what's the probability that it will? Virtually 100%. It's 0.9999 something. It's very likely. But because that idea comes up so easily in people's minds, it leads them astray to thinking that an event is more probable. I just saw the story of the kid who got cut on razor blades at the little playground where he went to play. Somebody, obviously a sick individual, taped razor blades or glued razor blades to this jungle gym. He cut his hands. That's very weird and very awful and very unlikely to happen anywhere else. You might see some copycat people do it, but what are the odds it'll be at your playground? Very, very, very low. But now I bet most parents who go to the playground, having seen this, that being a very available thought in mind, will start checking the equipment now, where they never would have thought to do so before. Not that that's a bad idea, you see, but it's not likely to happen. But it's more likely to affect their lives because it's so available. Does that make sense to everybody? That's the essence of the availability heuristic. Heuristics are subject to fallacies. Obviously, there's some fallacies there. This particular one that you'll want to know for your test, it's called the gambler's fallacy. And essentially what you're looking at is people believe that if something hadn't happened in a while, it's more likely to happen, right? Oh, that team's going to win. They're due for a win, right? They have this notion that, well, if I'm playing slots, for instance, well, I pulled the lever 100 times, well, surely I'm more likely to win the next time, right? It's about time for it to happen. That keeps people playing, and that's why it's called gambler's fallacy. But it's not just in the gambling arena, but you can see quite clearly if you had somebody flip a fair coin, meaning it's not biased to land on heads or tails, right? And they flipped the fair coin and they got to 10 heads. And you say, what's the next one going to be? More people would say tails, right? If you got to 50 heads in a row and say, what's it going to be next time? They'll go, well, it's got to be tails now, right? It's got to be tails. Because it hadn't been tails for so long. But in fact, each fair flip is equally likely to become heads or tails. It is unlikely that you would get 50 in a row. But statistically speaking, it's no more unlikely to get 51 in a row than 50. If that makes sense to you, what you're saying then is people who have this vision of if things haven't happened recently, they're more likely to happen, would think the same thing about airplanes, for example. Well, there hadn't been an airplane crash in a long time, so maybe it's more likely that there'll be one if I get on it now. So it leads us astray in our thinking because it's not logical, it's not probability-based, it's a heuristic, it's a shortcut. It seems logical, it seems plausible, and people bank on it, believing that it must be so. So they keep persisting at things maybe they shouldn't persist at, or they don't do things maybe they ought to do, where probabilities would be in their favor or against them because they simply have a fallacy that it's going to be more likely to happen if it hadn't happened in a while, whatever that may be. Could be anything, not just gambling. But overcoming these heuristics and fallacies is simply a matter of becoming conscious of the fact that you're using them as guiding principles in deciding how to interact with your life and interpret your life, etc.